Okay, everybody, so this is the first time that I'm going to be covering this segment, which is called something about the Romantic era. So basically every game that I show you has to involve some crazy sacrifices from a very, very long time ago. And that you will see. In fact, I immediately thought of this game that made a deep impression on me when I was a young chess player just starting out, and I thought, oh, this must be the best game ever played. Case closed. It is a good game, but that's highly subjective. In any case, as I continued to improve, I started to get this impression that the Romantic era was kind of a nice thing to think about, but everybody thought, well, you know, they were playing for the crowd, but they weren't necessarily playing the best moves. And in fact, during the 20th century, you see a big shift from that romanticism that would inspire people to attack at all costs and sacrifice as much material as possible, took a 180-degree turn. And all of a sudden, the best players in the world were focusing on getting small advantages and exploiting pawn structures and winning long, tense games where you would get the impression that they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting and waiting and capturing the opponent's pieces as they made mistakes. And it seemed like it was case closed. The Romantic era was over. But then AlphaZero came along. And especially with the advent of the first computers and the first really strong computers like Fritz, Houdini, and Stockfish, people started checking the games from the Romantic era and just tearing them apart, saying, oh, all these sacrifices are bad. Even Tal, sort of like the last vestige from the Romantic era, he was wrong in half his games. But then AlphaZero came along and just trounced Stockfish. And it did it in such a style, in such a way that's so unlike computers, that it just blew the door open on what the future of chess holds. Because I have the sneaking suspicion that if AlphaZero takes the games of a lot of these players from the Romantic era and of Tal, it might actually correct the previous evaluations of the other computers. AlphaZero might say, you know what? Tal was right after all. Or Zukertort was right, or Morphy was right. Because those evaluations done on a strictly materialistic basis, which drives engines such as Houdini and Stockfish, don't drive AlphaZero, because AlphaZero has different value systems. And obviously AlphaZero is onto something because it beat Stockfish by like a score of 155-6, which is a pretty wide margin. So I'm very excited to see what they do with AlphaZero. I hope they don't do what they did with Deep Blue after it beat Kasparov. They just disassembled it and hid it away in some warehouse with the Lost Ark of the Covenant. So I do hope that they have AlphaZero review some of these older games and see if this theory actually holds up, that maybe the old guys were really onto something. Because the future of chess definitely seems like it's heading back towards a sort of renaissance of these romantic ideas. Anyway, I thought I would show you two games. One of them is this game played back in 1883 between Zukertort and Blackburne. And then I wanted to show you one of the AlphaZero games that made an impression on me as a reinterpretation of this romanticism from none other than a computer. So I'm going to go through the opening fairly quickly. Some of the openings played in the 19th century actually hold up pretty well today. but that's going to be the subject for another discussion. Anyway, so the Zukertort system is actually, is it the Zukertort system or the Rubinstein system? I forget. I think it's the Zukertort, but it's a little bit different than this. Usually, it starts by keeping the pawn on c2 for a while. So since we just finished a lecture where the Kali figured quite prominently, the other option that white has here, instead of playing c3, is to play b3. And the point is to go something like this. And for example, if b6, castles, bishop b7, knight bd2, bishop d6, and knight e5. I believe this is called the Zukertort system. I don't know. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But it's a very interesting system where white tries to play for f4 and then a queen swing over to the king side, maybe some g4, g5 ideas as well. And you still see this played quite often. So that's just a quick aside. But in this game, Zukertort decided to play with the pawn on c4. And after queen e7, knight b5, it looks like black is able to eliminate an absolutely fundamental piece in black's position, which is the dark squared bishop. Because once white does this, not only do we secure the advantage of the bishop pair, but also black will become much more limited in terms of its possibilities of pawn structures, right? Without this dark square bishop, black can no longer consider embracing an isolated queen pawn, for example. Because an isolated queen pawn without the dark square bishop loses a lot of its sting. So very likely, instead of queen e7, black should have taken some precautions with a6, just to make sure that this bishop can stay alive. Of course, if white had tried to play knight b5 here, this bishop could have retreated to e7, so it's not a big deal. So let's see what happened. Knight e4, knight takes, pawn takes, knight d2, knight f6, f3, takes. This is a surprisingly mellow game for a romantic period. It seems like white secured the bishop pair and then just started maneuvering and nurturing the advantage. This is what you would expect from Petrosian rather than Zukertort. But we'll see that the game soon starts to get quite entertaining. So after dc4, bishop takes c4, d5, bishop d3, rook f to c8, rook a to e1. So I think this is where white starts thinking of this position in a very ambitious way. I think a lot of players would have simply played rook a c1, fought for the c file, traded off the rooks, and tried to make the bishop pair overpower the bishop and knight in some very boring endgame. However, rook a e1 intends to play the move e4, e5, and later f4, f5. And as we saw previously, if white manages to get a pawn to e5, that's immediately going to provide white with some excellent attacking chances. Because the f6 square, which is the natural defensive square for the black knight, is going to be under control. So this knight is probably going to have to go to d7 and f8, which is far from ideal. So after rook c7, white played e4, and after rook c8, e5. So everything's under control. And I really like this idea of ignoring black's play on the c file, because the bishops do a really great job at controlling the entry points. So the c file is open, but not really. It's not open for business because there's just no good way for the rook to break through. And after knight e8, f4. So in a couple of moves, white's position went from being, oh, this is going to be a nice, comfortable endgame to, okay, I could win in 20 moves. Well, we're actually outmoved 20, so maybe in another 5 or 10 moves. So g6, rook e3, f5, e takes f6, knight takes f6, and f5. So very nice pawn break. It's a move that looks very nice, but not a very hard move to find, right? Because the e-pawn is pinned, and if g takes f5, simply bishop takes, and the more the position opens up, the scarier these bishops look. So instead, black had planned to play the move knight to e4, which seems to make a lot of sense, because now if you have to go bishop takes e4, which is what happened in the game, d takes e4, and you've lost the bishop pair, and should black manage to block on d5, this bishop on b2 won't be able to participate so well in the attack. So fg6 and rook c2. Has anybody ever seen this game before? Oh my goodness. So I'm going to have to be careful with you guys. So what would you play here? Do you remember exactly what white did, or do you vaguely remember the game? And
it left such an impression on me that I showed it to one of my students. As for recalling the specific move here,
all right, so it's good. So we can try to figure it out together. So at least I'm not alone that it made an impression on you when you saw it, right?
Right.
Yeah. And it actually reminds me of that puzzle that you showed the other day with the crazy pins everywhere.
Okay.
You know? I think diagonals are an important theme in this game as well. So I mean, what moves would we look at here as white? What's that?
Take the pawn.
Yeah, so take the pawn, right? Keep opening some lines with check so we can deal with this problem of our queen later. But okay, king h8, and now we can't really delay this this issue anymore. What's that? I can't quite hear you. Yeah? Yeah?
I think d5.
Okay, so d5, and after e5?
Then d6.
So d6, let's see. Can I create some problems for you? So after d6, the point, I guess, is if I go rook takes d2, you're going to go d takes e7, and if I go rook takes b2, you're going to go rook f8. And that's it, right? So what else could I try to do here? Can I try to go queen g5? Or queen g7? I don't know. Because now the queen is hanging, the rook is also hanging on e3, and we're getting mated on g2. Any ideas? Or should we go back?
Yeah, rook g3.
Where?
Rook g3.
Rook g3? Okay.
Can you just take it?
Wait, be careful. I guess we can take here, and then if you take here, here.
Then he has to move to
What?
h6.
What's that?
Let's move to h6.
Yeah.
Bishop g7. Or bishop f4. No,
Bishop
f4
g7,
has to go
here, here. This looks pretty dangerous.
And then you just
So I should probably be a little bit careful here. Do I have to go queen takes d2?
No, you can take the rook takes g2 or queen takes g.
I could also try this, right? And if takes takes, or I could also try queen takes g3. Absolutely. So it looks like allowing this black queen to come to g5 provides black with moves that allow him to defend and attack at the same time. So very dangerous. Any other ideas? Boom. Queen b4. So a very similar idea to the one that Ashish, is that the one that you were saying before when we were looking at d6, queen g5, rook g3? You wanted to give up the queen in order to allow this bishop access to the e5 square. So you're onto the right idea, but the best way of executing it was right away with queen b4. And this is a great example of that I like to use whenever I'm trying to illustrate middle games or attacking positions where opposite color bishops are on the board. Another great one is Steinitz against Lasker from a Scotch opening, but that one is a little bit more mellow, where Lasker just needs to work the position a little bit more. It's not so heavy on the tactics. But here, after queen b4, we get a beautiful sequence. After rook c5, how should white play here? Is that a hand? Yes, maybe. No, don't turn around. I'm looking at you. Yeah, you. Oh, okay. I thought you were raising your hand. I didn't want to leave you hanging. Any ideas? Yeah.
Can we play rook g3 now?
Rook g3.
Yeah.
Okay. And let's say if rook g3, can we go bishop takes d5? Or maybe rook takes, oh no, we can't do that. Maybe rook takes b2? I don't know why I didn't say rook takes b2 for starters.
Well, I have another idea here. So instead of rook
So,
g3,
yeah?
can we put, instead of rook g3, can we play rook f8?
Ah, very interesting. And if I go queen takes,
Bishop e5.
and king takes h7,
Rook h3.
No, not rook h3.
Queen
Queen
e4?
h4.
yeah, and it looks like all of white's firepower is coming into the game, right? Because if we go here, then we're going to get checkmated. And if we go to h6, well, we should also get checkmated here, right?
Yeah, you just go
Rook
rook h3.
h3, king g5.
Oh, yeah, bishop F4.
Yeah, it's
Well,
Not right now.
No. Queen g5.
And then you.
this
Queen
is
g6 was,
where?
I mean, right there.
Oh, this is even faster. Well, it's actually the same thing.
I mean, but it's risky.
Huh? So it's still made in two. So that's right. Rook f8. Very nice deflection. But black played king takes h7.
Queen takes e4.
Queen takes e4. King g7.
Rook g3.
Where? Rook g3. King takes f8.
How about bishop takes e5?
Bishop takes e5. King takes f8.
Rook f3.
King e8. What's that? At what point?
Like king e8, queen g6.
King d7?
Yes,
Wait.
no?
That's right, I have.
So, what? Which move are we looking at? Bishop takes, right?
Yes.
So, king takes.
Rook f3.
King here.
Queen g6.
So the thing is that you've given up some material here. So if I go king d7, you want to go rook f7?
Yeah,
Is this so clear? Oh, because you're going to go queen d6. I have to be careful with that. Huh. And what about if I go here?
And king to
King takes, and then I take the rook. And if queen takes, then I just take here.
Earlier, I think you played queen f3.
Yeah.
How about back before the bishop takes e5 sacrifice, the rook is still on f8. How about rook f1? Stops any checking ideas, blocks that prevents the king from running away.
So rook f1. Okay, fair enough. And can we try this again? Oh no, but then queen takes with check. What am I talking about? So you're threatening rook g3 or queen g4. Can we take this bishop?
so we play queen g4 and then rook h3.
That looks really strong. Here, rook h3. If I have to do this, that's pretty sad.
Rook f8.
Yeah, rook f8.
So how about bishop c8, gaining control over g4 and h3?
Oh, all right.
Rook g.
Well, then it doesn't make much difference because
Right, you still have bishop e5 as well.
Or rook g3, queen g6.
Rook g3, so king h8.
Now bishop e5?
Yeah, I mean, this is over. Rook f1 looks like a very interesting move. Yeah, it sort of keeps everything, all the threats in the air. And on top of that, I mean, we're up a couple of pawns, so this is definitely game over. In the game, white took on e5 and played bishop g7, which is sort of letting down the hammer even faster, right? So the point is that you're going to lose your queen, because if you take here, then queen e8, checkmate. So black played king g8, and after queen e7, just resign. Now, the reason I'm showing you guys this game is because even though I believe we're at a sort of renaissance of the Romantic period, at the very early stages of it, the type of romantic games that we're going to be seeing in our times is going to be very different. So yes, there will be material sacrifices, but the way the game will develop will be very different. So I wanted to show you this game between AlphaZero and Stockfish. We're going to go through the opening again fairly quickly, but if you play d4 with white, and if you don't know what to do against the Queen's Indian, I highly recommend the games that AlphaZero played against Stockfish. He completely wiped Stockfish off the board in the Queen's Indian. And all the games involve like sacrifices of 3, 4 pawns, a piece, it doesn't matter. And the way that AlphaZero appreciates the compensation is based on 2 driving forces. Number 1 is king safety, and number 2 is just achieving a nice bind on the position. So if you have your king slightly exposed and you're kind of cramped, AlphaZero will give you all the material that you want. It doesn't care. It considers those 2 factors just to outweigh material very heavily, as we'll see in this game. So bishop b7, castles, castles, d5, and this is a well-known theoretical line that involves sacrificing a pawn. So this is not an innovation by AlphaZero at all. And these positions, I've actually played them with white, and I very rarely sacrifice pawns in the opening, are very annoying to have to play with black. White's going to go e4, knight c3, queen g4, bishop h6, rook ad1. White's position has a very nice flow to it. But if you're playing against a computer, we see the computer always favoring these lines, where if it's not absolutely clear what you're getting for the pawn, it's going to take it and hold on to it. So that's why this match, I believe, introduced us to a new paradigm in chess, because we see this clash of materialism against like meta materialism that AlphaZero has ushered in. So after e4, bishop f6, knight d6. I'm pretty sure this has been played many times. Let's see. Probably tons of games. I don't know what database this is linked to, but okay, there's only 3. That's a little bit surprising. So bishop a6, rook e1, knight e8, e5, takes. And here we see the first really surprising moment in the game. E takes f6, queen takes f6. So now we're down 2 pawns. But okay, we have the bishop pair. Black's king safety isn't an issue yet, but we are in the early stages of getting a bind on black's position, especially these pieces that seem to be out of the game, and also this knight on d6, which looks a little bit loose. So let's see how AlphaZero keeps increasing the pressure. By the way, there are some moments in this game that I have absolutely no clue what's going on. So that's going to be my disclaimer. I've played over this game many, many times, and I still can't believe that white's position is good, some half of it. So bishop c4, h4, typical AlphaZero move, just, okay, I'm down 2 pawns, I guess I'll just play h4, gain some space. Hopefully threaten bishop g5, which is definitely a threat now, and provoke h6. And now b3. Let's turn this off. All right, so after queen takes c3, bishop f4. So now we're down 2 pawns and a piece. Okay, we will be getting our piece back, but it's probably going to involve giving up more pawns, right? Because after knight b7, b takes c4, queen f6. Now, if Stockfish didn't take this pawn, there's probably a really good reason for it. So, what's that?
Queen's very exposed here.
Okay, but how do we take advantage of that?
If it was like this, I bet AlphaZero probably played rook ac1, sacrifice the pawn too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that if against rook c1 you would take this pawn, I agree, you would go for it. But I'm thinking white can also try to take advantage of this queen by playing something like rook e4 and then trying to take on h6. I don't want to presume that I have any idea what AlphaZero is thinking, because I really don't. And I would already start asking myself if stuff like this doesn't work either, right? Because after pawn takes, rook e4, now you don't even have queen d5 because of the discovery. So instead, black went queen f6, and now bishop e4. And this is really the kind of romanticism that I think is coming our way, where the sacrifices will not be based so much on variations, but rather they will be intuitive. We will have to take a leap of faith and believe that when you have 3 very important pieces that can't get out, and a potential attack on your opponent's king, then that's going to equal eventually a won game. So I believe accurate evaluations are going to be more and more vague, and the ability to recognize patterns, attacking patterns, long-term attacking patterns, is going to be what the world's top players are going to be required to master. So knight a6, bishop e5. Well, this is a pretty straightforward tactic, right? If queen takes, white simply wins the queen. So black plays queen e6, and now bishop d3. So again, threatening a discovery on the queen. So black plays f6, and now bishop d4. And after queen f7, queen g4. So white's pieces keep creeping closer and closer to the black king. And also now we see that the advances h6 and f6 have created a clear target. And this is a typical square that we would use to create a clamp on a position, right? If we put a bishop on g6, we see that this king on g8 is going to be under constant threat of back rank problems. So after rook fd8, rook e3, knight c5, and bishop g6. Queen f8, and rook d1. So the game goes on as if nothing had happened. Rook b8, king g2, knight e6, bishop c3. I love this quiet maneuvering when you're down 2 pawns. And by the way, this is not an exception to the games that were played in this match. Has anybody looked at the entire match? Or the entire match hasn't been published. They've only published some 20 games that AlphaZero won. But has anybody seen them? No? Maybe one or two? Ashish, you said you saw one where, with the rook sacrifice, right? Yeah? How about there in the back? Was that a hand? No? Well, I highly recommend you guys check these games out. They're a glimpse into the future, in my opinion. And I remember when this first happened, I thought, oh, it's kind of a publicity stunt. They're trying to sell a new engine or something like that. And when I saw it, I realized I'd never seen anything like this before. The games are just unreal. And I would say this is one of the milder examples, but it's one of the simpler ones too. So the game went knight b c5, rook d e1, knight a4, and bishop d2. So now that the bishop has done its job along the a1 h8 diagonal, and by done its job, I mean provoked this weakening move f6 so that we could land our bishop on g6. The bishop comes back to d2, and we'll probably start threatening moves like bishop takes h6. This reminds me of a typical pattern you see in isolated queen pawn positions, where usually white's light square bishop will come to b3. And the point of putting the bishop on b3 is to put pressure on f7. And when black has a pawn on e7, he'll have to at some point deal with the pressure by playing e7 to e6. And then once that job is done, the bishop simply returns back to c2. And actually, it's the other way around. It's on b3, it goes to c2 to provoke g6. And then it comes back to b3 to create sacrifices on e6. And I think there's an analogous idea going on here, where the bishop has done its weakness-provoking job on c3, and now it's simply going to come back and create some real threats. So king h8, f4, queen d6, and bishop c1. Knight d4, rook e7, f5. Whenever a computer starts returning material, that's a sign of impending doom, right? Most of these engines are programmed to have material as the sole driving force. Well, king safety, of course, is up there. But they will never give you back material unless there is an immediate threat or they just don't know what to do. And I think that the second case is what's going on here. Black is just shuffling back and forth with the pieces. It looks like the knights have gotten a little bit more active, but really they're not doing anything. So after f5, bishop takes f5, knight takes, queen takes, rook f8, rook takes d7, rook f5, rook d6. So white trades into an endgame, and you would think, oh, the worst is over because, well, if you go c5, trying to hold on to your pawn, you might start to realize that this knight is still out of the game, and white can simply play a rook d7, followed by a rook e to e7. Your knight can never come into the game with knight c3 because it's going to run into bishop b2, and everybody's ganging up on the g7 pawn. So this endgame is actually over. So white simply traded off into a winning endgame, and it doesn't feel like a computer game. It feels like a game that any of us could have played downstairs during a rapid game even. So after rook f7, g4, not even taking the pawn on c6. Now after rook takes c6, what do you guys think AlphaZero could have been concerned about?
Its opponent's counterplay.
What's that?
Its opponent's counterplay.
And what counterplay might that be?
Such as bringing the rook to the d file.
Okay, so you're saying this move?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Then the knight can jump to c5.
Adi, is that what you were going to say?
I was gonna say to c3.
Knight c3? Okay, and if we put a bishop here? Can you take this? You're going to go for it?
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean this doesn't seem like such a big deal, right? Now we have to move the rook. Maybe here. Yeah, maybe we can go h5, h6, something like that. It
King over, like king h7 to stop that. No, like go. After all that, king g8.
Yeah,
Rook g6.
yeah.
And king h7.
Okay, so let's say I go here.
Um,
I guess you bring your knight out, right?
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it still looks pretty good for white. We're up a pawn and we have pressure against g7. But maybe we can do better. Maybe not. Maybe against this, king h7, we can go here.
Can I just take the pawn?
This one?
What?
Well, here I'm going to take, right? But if you go knight b4, the point that I was trying to make is that maybe I can do this. But you do have a knight d3 move. Although I could probably just go here. Yeah. In any case, it still looks like white's position is pretty good. So instead of rook takes c6, what I was thinking was maybe it was worried about h5. Clamping down on some light squares here. But I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at rook e5, and this looks completely winning too. So it's a bit of an enigma. Every time I go through these games, I try to understand what these moves are about. And it's not easy at all. So king g8 and g5. So notice that AlphaZero doesn't really care about material unless it advances its two goals of clamping down on the opponent's position and attacking the king. If it doesn't do those two things, it's sort of, why would I do that, right? Instead here, we see that with g4, g5, white is trying to get the pawn to g6 and renew this pressure along the back rank. So takes, knight c5, king f3, knight b7, rook d1. After knight a5, rook e4. c5, bishop b2, knight c6, and g6. There we go. So the idea has been carried out. Even though the material is even, we start feeling another clamp coming on black's position. This pawn on g6 will again renew the threats on the black king on g8. So rook c7, king g4, knight d4, and rook d2. Rook f8, bishop takes, pawn takes, and rook takes. So now white does take the pawn after having secured the pawn on g6. And we enter a rook endgame, which are notoriously drawish, but I was very convinced by what I saw from white's part. Basically, any rook endgame where you're down a king is going to be a lost cause. So king g5, rook f8, rook d2, rook c6, rook d5. This is just, that is an unanswerable question. Here, instead of a3, I really don't know why it played a3. If I was playing with white, I would already start thinking about trading off some rooks, maybe doing something like rook here in order to play either rook e8 or rook e7. We'll see in the game something similar.
Sir, can you turn that phone off, please? Whose phone is that? It's driving me crazy. And it's no one's phone. Oh,
Yeah?
I guess we'll deal with it. All right.
Okay. So a3, rook c7, a4. So there you go. That's your explanation. The point of a3 was zugzwang. Now, wasted a tempo. No, I'm just kidding. There's no point. So a6, rook d4, rook c8, rook e5. Yeah, these maneuvers drive me bananas. But okay, the rooks got traded off. This is what I would have tried to do. I would have tried to trade off one rook and highlight the fact that I have an active king, my opponent has a passive king, I have an active rook, my opponent has a passive rook. This formula for rook endgames almost never fails. So, rook a8, usually in a rook endgame, you would be willing to sacrifice a pawn just to get active. So in this position, if white was down a pawn, white would probably still be winning, or much, much better. The fact that material is even just makes it worse for black. So rook c6, very logical. What's that? I'm sorry, yeah, I meant to say like if white were down a pawn instead of up a pawn, as opposed to material being equal. So you went rook e6. I have no clue why you wouldn't go rook c6 here. What's that? No, it went rook e6. And after king f8, then rook c6. I don't know. I mean, how do you stop anything? It basically just, the only thing rook e6 does is forces your king to f8, which you would think is useful for black, right? Just to get the king out of that mating net. But now king f4, king d7 takes, here, check. And after king g5, it just resigned, right? Takes, takes, you're going to get checked, and your pawn's gone. So, I'm not a fan of chess computers, but I am a fan of AlphaZero. And a lot of people are worried about the future of chess because of engines. They think, oh, engines are just going to work it all out, and it's not going to be fun anymore. But it seems like the way that chess is going to get worked out is not necessarily by forced calculation, but rather by just some intuitive attacking patterns like we see in AlphaZero's games. So do we have any questions before we call it a night? No? We're good? Okay, guys, so thanks for sticking around, and I'll be seeing you around this week and the next couple of weeks as well. All right, thank you.